Good evening, everyone. I'm Christiane and welcome to our program, where we aim to delve more deeply into the stories that most impact our world. Tonight's brief: what will it take to stop the carnage in Syria? It appears that a ceasefire that went into effect last week is unraveling and the dead are piling up again. The international community has voiced its outrage, but it's become abundantly clear, and my sources confirm, that neither the United States nor any Western or regional coalition intends to intervene militarily. Not in this election year, not when war-weary voters from Paris, France to Paris, Texas have the last word. But if anything is going to change, it'll take leadership from the White House. So how should American power be used? In a moment, we'll explore that with two senior U.S. officials who have strongly opposing views. But first, let's look at what can happen when the U.S. leads and when it doesn't. 20 years ago this month, war broke out in Bosnia, and we covered it extensively. The killing of civilians there went on for more than 3 years. The world looked on in horror, but world leaders did nothing more than try to provide humanitarian aid and wring their hands as ethnic cleansing, actually genocide, unfolded on our watch. And then came the worst massacre in Europe since World War II at Srebrenica, where 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were systematically murdered. Now the world resolved to act. Led by the United States, bombing of Serbian military targets ended the war and did bring peace. In terrible contrast, around the same time, the failure to act to stop the genocide in Rwanda saw 1 million people slaughtered in 3 months. Fast forward again to today, and we face the same dilemma. Was it really more important to head off a massacre in Libya with NATO air support, and less important to stop the slaughter of civilians that's happening in Syria now? And if so, why? And if not, when should there be action? That's what I want to ask the Obama administration's point person on Syria, UN Ambassador Susan Rice, and also the man who ran against President Obama for the presidency back in 2008, Republican Senator John McCain. But first, a live report from inside Syria. Now, we have consistently tried to get Syrian government officials to speak to us, but so far they've refused. And so to get a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground, we turn to Sami Ibrahim in Homs. He's an activist who's been monitoring human rights abuses since the uprising began. Sami, thank you for joining us. Can you tell me what you have seen today and in these days since the ceasefire is meant to have taken effect?
Actually, no ceasefire at all at Homs. The killing and the shelling is keep continuous against the civilians from Assad army. 8 citizens have been killed, and each half an hour or each hour we are receiving at our organization names of the killing persons, and we are trying our level best to contact with their family to confirm and to try to do our level best to help the people.
Sami, how do you get out to document what you're telling us? How can you see what you're telling us?
Actually, sometimes by field visiting, it's very difficult, it's very dangerous. For your question, we are in contact with the family. We are very famous. Our Skype address is very famous inside all the Syria.
Sami, how many people do you say have been killed today?
Today, 65 persons, 14 at Idlib, 18 at the Homs, 4 at Daraa, 2 at Safref of Damascus, 1 at Aleppo.
Sami Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us from Homs.
Thank you.
And joining me now here in the studio, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. And congratulations on your new show.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We want to get to the bottom of how this is going to end in Syria. You've just heard this activist in Homs, and I presume you have your own information about the ceasefire. Is it holding? Would you say it's holding?
No. I think it's clear that over the last several days, particularly since Saturday, the violence has escalated. We've seen reports, particularly from Homs and more recently from Idlib, of heavy weapons, heavy artillery resuming. So I think it's quite clear that this cessation of violence was short-lived, and it's very much fraying.
So what happens then? Does that mean the Annan mission is over? Kofi Annan's efforts to broker some end to this?
I don't think it's over, but it certainly means it's in jeopardy because, of course, the Kofi Annan six-point plan entailed in the first instance a mutual cessation of violence with the government taking the first steps. It paused more or less for 2 days, Thursday and Friday last week, and then the violence has resumed. The Security Council on Saturday approved dispatched the deployment of an advanced mission of small number of observers with the idea of deploying a larger mission if, in fact, the cessation holds and if, in fact, the government upholds its commitments. We're going to get a report in the next couple of days from the Secretary General of the UN recommending that deployment, and I think if the situation on the ground hasn't stabilized, if the government is not indeed fulfilling its commitments and the violence is escalating, it's going to be very difficult for the Council to send unarmed observers into a hot war.
And would you confirm what we're being told, that these monitors, the initial group that has arrived, hasn't even been allowed to do its work yet?
I don't have specifics on that. I mean, what we've heard is there are only 6 of them there. They are liaising with the government. Yep. They don't have yet all that they would need, like in terms of armored vehicles and the like, for full maneuverability. We'll hear better from the Secretary General about whether the circumstances are right.
So anyway, they've told us that they haven't even left the hotel, which is eerily similar to the last round of monitors that went there. So my question to you is this then. You're saying the ceasefire is unraveling, that this may or may not work, the monitor mission, and that Annan's mission may or may not continue. So what happens next? Does one give another deadline? Do you say to President Assad, you either stop now or else?
Well, I think, first of all, the international community has backed Kofi Annan and his plan for a variety of reasons. He's an experienced diplomat. He's neutral. And indeed, he has a plan, the logic of which we can all agree to.
Which involves Assad stepping down.
Which involves a political transition which will inevitably result in Assad stepping down. Now, as you know, for many, many months prior to that, the Security Council, the international community was divided. Russia and China were protecting Assad. What has changed now with the Annan plan is that Russia and China, Russia especially, are invested in its success. I believe that had they not put some measure of pressure on Assad, he wouldn't have agreed to the Annan plan or even a brief pause in the violence. So I think
that's a success. You've got the whole Security Council on board right now.
It's a very first step. Let's not overstate it. But the point I'm making here, Christiane, is the next step really is for those who have maximum influence on Assad to continue to use it and make it plain to Assad that either he takes this chance that Kofi Annan and the united international community is offering to end this thing peacefully, or he's going to face increased pressure. And
but
Russia
what
and
is
China,
increased pressure? Because most people say, I mean, you've made it quite clear that the United States is not going to intervene, and the other powers have made it clear that militarily there won't be any intervention.
Well, several things. First of all, we're part of a discussion today in Paris about how to strengthen the sanctions that are already in place.
Those are sanctions. I'm talking about.
But I'm talking. When I say pressure, I do mean economic pressure, political pressure. We're supporting the opposition through the peaceful opposition through non-lethal assistance of communications equipment and medical support.
But what is it really doing? I mean, there aren't any significant defections. The sanctions haven't sort of burst open the coalition around Assad. He's still there.
Let me finish the thought, and then let me come back to what I think you want to talk about, which is military intervention. With respect to what has changed, Russia and China now have a great stake in the success of the Annan plan. They have the maximum leverage on Assad. If Assad continues to refuse, Russia and China are going to face a very difficult choice. Either they put pressure on Assad to adhere to his commitments or join in the international community doing it, or they look like they weren't serious. So that's what's new, and that's an important change. Now, coming to the question of what is the international community going to do in terms of military intervention? I think from the U.S. point of view, we're rightly very apprehensive about increasing the militarization of this conflict. It's already a hot war. It could spill over, as we saw threatened a couple of weeks ago, into Turkey and Lebanon. It is a society that is fractured on sectarian lines, the same sectarian lines that we see throughout the countries in the region. So it's not in the United States' interest, if this can still possibly be resolved peacefully, to jump towards military solutions.
When will you think that it cannot be possibly resolved peacefully? I mean, bodies are still piling up. Many officials who I talk to who have actually dealt with President Assad say that really all he understands in these situations is a credible threat of force, frankly, to be put there for him to meet these obligations, and that's not on the table.
If only it were that simple,
elsewhere.
Christiane. If only it were that simple.
But I'm not suggesting it's simple, but it was elsewhere.
It was elsewhere.
For instance,
so let's talk
Libya.
about Libya. Libya was quite a different circumstance. You had the entire region and the Arab League united behind a call to the international community to back a no-fly zone and the protection of civilians. You had a unified Security Council that authorized that action. You had NATO and Arab countries willing to participate in that action. Very crucially, you had on the ground a unified, coherent opposition that controlled territory starting from the strategic and major city of Benghazi in the east, from which they were able to push out. None of those circumstances are, in fact, the case in the context of Syria, particularly the opposition, which remains fragmented, relatively unknown to the outside world, and certainly not coherent, controlling territory from which it could push out.
So I definitely hear your position. I know that that's your position. But you, of course, were in the Clinton administration, and you saw the preemptive humanitarian intervention in Kosovo after Bosnia. That was not a UN resolution. By no means were all countries on board, and yet President Clinton led with his allies in order to stop a carnage. Yeah. Why can't that happen today?
Well, first of all, as you'll recall, that was a NATO mission conducted purely from the air.
Right. This is what I'm talking about here.
What
Nobody's talking about boots on the ground.
Some people are talking about humanitarian corridors, which definitely entail boots on the ground. I think your next guest has proposed humanitarian safe havens and humanitarian corridors. There's no way to affect that without putting boots on the ground.
So are you ruling that out, humanitarian corridors?
I am being very plain about what the administration's position is, that our strong preferences, and we think the bulk of the American people would like to see this resolved, if possible, through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, support, non-lethal support to the opposition, rather than getting into what would be a much, much more complicated and involved war than ever we've considered in the context of Kosovo or Libya. Let's be clear, Christiane, the air defenses that Syria has, the neighbors that back it, the superpowers outside the neighborhood that back it, make this all a very different, much more complicated situation than either of the two we've just been discussing.
I know that's your position. You know that many people have different opinions on that.
They may have different prescriptions, but I've been describing a series of facts which are pretty much indisputable. Now, you could come to a different conclusion about what to do in light of those facts, but I don't think we can dispute that Iran, Russia, other countries in the region, Turkey, all have stakes on different sides of this equation.
You mentioned Iran. Isn't Syria and the dispatch of the current regime much more, for instance, in the United States' strategic interest, given its ties with Iran, than a Libya, for instance?
Absolutely. We think that it is time for Assad to go. We put pressure on to that effect, and we're going to continue to and ramp that up. The question is, how do you accomplish that? And there's no simple method of accomplishing this through simple airstrikes, particularly when the opposition doesn't control territory from which to push out, when Syria has some of the most sophisticated air defenses in the region, and when it has the backing of some major powers around the world.
Do you see, if there is no compliance by the Assad government, one of the options is safe areas, another option is referring him to the International Criminal Court. What are you discussing now to ramp up pressure beyond economics?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't discount the economic pressure. The pressure on the Assad regime has intensified economically. Their currency is in their foreign reserves. All of these things are under enormous pressure. And we would like to see that pressure increase through further multilateralizing of the economic sanctions.
But what happens
with respect
next?
To the ICC and with respect to accountability, we have been absolutely clear that those responsible for the atrocities, including the leadership in Syria, must be held accountable. But for an ICC referral to happen in this instance, unfortunately, again, that has to come from the Security Council or from the state itself, and Syria is not an ICC party. So the only opportunity for that is from the Security Council, which would again require the assent of Russia and China, which I don't see as likely in the near term.
On that note, Ambassador Rice, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And coming up, lead, follow, or get out of the way, we'll ask Senator John McCain in a moment. He's just returned from visiting Syrian refugees in Turkey, and you'll want to hear what he has to say, so stay with us.